Good morning or afternoon or evening. We'll wait a minute or so as people join. So thanks. Okay, I'm going to get started. Thanks everybody for being here this whatever time of day it is for you. I'm going to continue along our module 2 of our Red Open course on development economics, credit, insurance, and risk. And today we'll be talking about savings, so the flip side of credit. And so there are many, many motives for saving. People save over their life cycle, for retirement. People save for intergenerational transmission of wealth. People save to deal with seasonality, a particularly important type of savings in agricultural economies where seasonality is built into the economy. People save in order to accumulate assets to address fixed costs or lumpy purchases, and people save to address risk. And we're going to focus mostly on this last motive for why people save and how people use savings to help deal with risk. So we'll start with a very simple model, just as a benchmark. And then we'll talk about barriers that prevent people from saving in accordance with this benchmark model. I'm focusing on today external barriers that that an individual faces from lack of access to markets or from other forces outside themselves, and behavioral barriers starting tomorrow with Pascaline Dupas. I guess I should introduce myself. I'm Chris Udry. I'm a professor of economics at Northwestern, and I'm pleased to be doing this this class, the first of 2 on savings. Pascaline Dupas from Stanford will be doing the next lecture tomorrow morning. Okay, so let's start with a nice simple model and use that as a benchmark for trying to understand how savings works in poor countries. So our benchmark will be an individual making decisions about allocating resources over time. This individual, she faces an exogenous variable income process. There might be variations in the flow of income that she receives, and she has a market interest rate that she faces. Her utility at time t, looking forward into the future, is going to be modeled as the expected value of the sum of her future utility from now, time equal to t, up to the end of her planning horizon, capital T. And so in each period, tau, between now and that time period, she gets some utility from consumption. A conventional way of modeling this sub-utility function would be that V of T plus A, which depends upon consumption in period T plus A, is just going to be discounted geometrically at rate delta. And the utility function will be stable over time. That's a conventional set of assumptions. It doesn't need to be that assumption. And we'll assume that she faces a resource constraint, that she comes into the period owning some wealth, assets at time t. She gets her random income at time t, yt. She chooses how much to eat at time t. Everything that's left over is savings, which then gets transferred to the next period, growing at interest rate 1 plus r into the assets that she begins next period. We will tie her down so she can't let her assets go impossibly negative or impossibly positive. We're going to tie her down and say that when she finishes her planning horizon, she has to have zero balance. And we're going to call the assets that you enter period T with, plus the income that she gets at the start of period T, cash on hand. So what have we assumed? We've already made a whole bunch of assumptions in that little 2 minutes. We've assumed unlimited, perfectly enforced, zero transactions costs, borrowing and savings. That's what this means. Right here, we're just saying you can take resources from period T and put them into period T plus 1 at this fixed interest rate. You can take them from period T plus 1 and bring them to period T at this fixed interest rate. We haven't put any restrictions on borrowing or savings. And so we've assumed you can do as much as you want. We've assumed time separable preferences. We've assumed expected utility maximization. We've assumed deeper things like you only care about your own consumption. We've assumed that there's only one consumption good, and so on. We've made a bunch of assumptions already. But let's stick with those assumptions for now. And define a value function. So a value function, which is an extraordinarily useful tool, is the expected utility of somebody who makes the optimal consumption choice now, given the cash on hand they have now, knowing that she will continue to make optimal consumption choices in the future. So the value at time t of having these assets at time t, which you brought into from the past, and getting an income of yt, is going to be equal to the maximum over savings, the choice of savings that you're going to make this period. And you'll get utility this period from consuming what you brought into the period, AT, plus what you earn in the period, YT, minus your savings. Okay, so AT plus YT minus S is going to be your consumption. So you get utility today from that, plus you get the expected value starting next period of entering next period with whatever you saved magnified by the interest rate. So this will be your assets in period T plus 1 and your income in period T plus 1. This is an expectation because you don't know what YT plus 1 is going to be at time T. Okay. So that's what I just wrote in the last slide. So if we find the first order condition, if we just choose S to optimally balance my utility from consumption now, plus my expected value of having stuff next period, well, that's going to make my marginal utility of consumption today. That's here. When we differentiate with respect to S, we get the derivative of this, which is just V prime of t, and it's evaluated at CT, how much we're consuming. That's going to be equal to, well, the expected discounted marginal value of assets next period. Okay. And at the optimal savings, by the envelope theorem, we know that V prime of t, that is the marginal value of cash on hand today, is going to be equal to little v prime of t, of consumption. That is, we're going to balance the marginal utility of consumption today with the marginal value of cash on hand today at the optimum. So when we substitute this relationship into this, we get the marginal value of consumption today. It's going to be the expected marginal value of consumption tomorrow. Okay. That's the very familiar Euler equation that you've all seen before. The marginal utility of consumption today is today's expectation of the expected marginal utility of consumption tomorrow. Now, if we make a few other assumptions, we'll get to the permanent income hypothesis. So this is the Euler equation we just wrote down. Now, let's make some more assumptions. If we assume that we have, rather than a utility function that is indexed by the period t, we assume that you get this, you have the same utility function in every period. It's just v. Okay, so you just have some preferences that relate how much you consume to your utility, and that's not changing over time. The only thing that's changing over time is that you're going to discount it by a discount factor delta. So 1 over 1 plus delta is the discount that you put on your future consumption relative to today's consumption. And if we also assume that the interest rate is fixed, just to make life easy for ourselves, this becomes the Euler equation. So we're just simplifying it a little bit. We've got marginal utility of consumption today is expected marginal utility consumption tomorrow, discounted by the balance between the rate of return to savings versus your discount rate. If the rate of return to savings, R, is greater than your discount rate, this number is going to be bigger than 1. And you're going to have the expected marginal utility today smaller than the marginal utility consumption today smaller than the expected marginal utility tomorrow. In other words, you're going to be saving more. You're going to have your consumption growing over time because the return to savings is high. Or if the return to savings is lower than your discount rate, this is going to be a number smaller than 1. The marginal utility today is going to be smaller than the expected marginal utility of consumption tomorrow, and you're going to have more consumption today than tomorrow in expectation. But if they balance, if we let R equal to delta, this becomes just the number 1, so it disappears. And if we let the utility function be quadratic, then when we take derivatives, all we're left with is 2 times k minus c. And so the 2k is separate, get difference out on the 2 sides, the 2 divides. And so we're left with my consumption today is equal to the expected value of consumption tomorrow, which is the martingale property of consumption under these special assumptions. Okay, go one step further. Okay, so this is a really simple expression for how you expect consumption to move over time when there's perfect savings and credit markets. And it has very strong implications for what we expect to see in the data. So the lifetime budget constraint is that the present value of future consumption, so the expectation today of the stream of future consumption that you're going to have from now until the end of time, discounted by the interest rate. So this is now telling me that the present value of my future consumption has got to be equal to my current assets plus the expected value of my future income, because that's just balancing my budget. Okay. So if we let t go to infinity and we solve for CT, remember we've got this nice easy thing. The expected value at time t of future consumption is just equal to consumption today. So we can just substitute CT in for all these expected future consumptions, bring the CT out, this infinite series converges, and we're left with this simple equation for consumption. Consumption today is just the annuity value. That's what this is. This is the annuity value of wealth. That tells you how much wealth, if you've got a certain level of wealth, this tells you how much you can consume every period without making the wealth disappear. And this is your wealth. Your wealth is your current assets plus the expected value of your future income. And so consumption is just equal to the annuity value of your permanent income. This is your permanent income, your wealth, the value of your assets plus the expected value of your discount, the expected discounted value of your future flows of income. And so you're just going to consume your permanent income. And so that is the permanent income hypothesis. transitory shocks in one period to your income Y have minimal impact on C. They're fully saved. If you get a transitory shock that increases your income in one period, that's going to just have essentially no effect on this permanent income. And so there'll be no change in your consumption. You'll save it all. And so transitory shocks have no impact on consumption. A permanent shock, if your income surprisingly to you goes up by 1 unit and it's going to stay higher than you had previously expected forever, then your consumption will go up by that same 1 unit. Okay. So transitory shocks will have no impact on consumption. They'll be saved fully. And permanent income shocks will be consumed fully. Okay, so that's the permanent income hypothesis. That's the benchmark. That's what we would assume guides people's savings and borrowing decisions in this simple world of costless savings, perfect access to credit markets, special assumptions on preferences, and so on. Okay, so it's crazy, but that's a benchmark we can start from. We'll expect to see all transitory shocks saved and all permanent shocks consumed. Okay. If we generalize the preferences a little bit, then we get a slightly richer model of savings, which is still simple enough to serve as a simple benchmark. So marginal utility is positive, right? That's just, you always like eating more. So the utility function is increasing. So V prime of C is positive for all levels of consumption. Risk aversion is the property that the marginal utility of consumption is diminishing. That is, the first bits of consumption you have give you very high marginal utility. As you get to consume more and more, each additional unit of consumption increases your utility by less and less. That, combined with the expected utility assumption, is what provides us with risk aversion. Now we'll talk about the third derivative. The third derivative of the utility function determines whether the utility function has precaution. If the third derivative of the utility function is positive, we say that the consumer has precautionary motives for savings. Why is that? Well, when the third derivative of the utility function is positive, that means that at low levels of consumption, fluctuations in consumption hurt more than similar fluctuations at high levels of consumption. Okay, so you're more risk averse when you're poorer than when you're richer if your preferences have a third derivative that's positive. So it's a little crazy to think about third derivatives of these mythical things called utility functions, but there's something intuitive about it, that when you're poor, risk hurts more than when you're rich. And so precautionary savings, if there's precautionary motives for savings, that is the third derivative of the utility function is positive, that's the same thing as saying that the marginal utility function is decreasing and convex. Okay, we know that the marginal utility function is decreasing. That's what gives us risk aversion in the first place. Having the marginal utility function being convex means that the preferences have precaution. So if this is your level of consumption on the right-hand axis, and this is your marginal utility, V prime, marginal utility is going to be declining in consumption, right? That's what risk aversion means. Having it be convex in consumption means it looks like this. Okay. So an increase in the variability of consumption is going to increase the right-hand side of the Euler equation. Here's the Euler equation we have. Here's the marginal utility of consumption today is going to be equal to the discounted expected marginal utility of consumption tomorrow. And so if we increase the variability of consumption, that's like bouncing around. An increase in the variability of consumption without changing the mean of consumption might be, you're bouncing around between these two levels of consumption. The expected value of that marginal utility is given by this chord that connects those 2 points. And so here's the expected utility of somebody. This is the expected marginal utility of somebody facing that level of risk. And if you have a higher level of risk where you're bouncing around between bigger variations of consumption, that's going to have a higher value of the expected marginal utility. So if we increase risk, that's going to increase this right-hand side. If we increase risk while keeping the mean of consumption the same, that increases the right-hand side of this equation by Jensen's inequality. And so since this is going up, that means this has to go up. But if this goes up, that means consumption is going down. So that means that consumption must decline, that is, savings increases to compensate for the expected future variability. So that's what we mean by precautionary savings. Precautionary savings means that when you expect to have variation in your consumption in the future, you're going to save in advance to protect yourself from the effects of that risk. Okay. So, so in our permanent income hypothesis with quadratic utility, the third derivative of the utility function was 0. So there's no precautionary motive. So in the permanent income model, we don't have a precautionary motive. Consumption is just going to depend on the expected value of future income. If the future income variance goes up, it's not going to affect consumption in the permanent income model. But if there's precautionary savings, it will. Okay. We're going to come back to that in a moment. So the basic insight of this benchmark model is that people faced with transitory income shocks should save those income shocks fully. That is, if they get a good shock to their income that's temporary, they should save that extra income. If they get a bad shock to their income, they should dissave that amount. They'll only change their consumption in response to permanent shocks. So Chris Paxson, in a famous paper in 1992, addressed this question. Do farmers use savings to smooth consumption in the face of transitory income shocks? The main empirical obstacle is that when you open up a data set, it doesn't usually come with a variable labeled transitory income. You might have data on income, but what's transitory income? So the main innovation of Paxson's paper is that she noted that the income of farmers is related to rainfall. And so she used transitory shocks to rainfall, identified from a long time series of rainfall, to identify a transitory shock to income. This is an incredibly simple and intuitive idea, and it has been used many, many times since. I can't say this with 100% certainty, but I believe Paxson is the first person to use rainfall as an instrument in economics. She's the first person to use transitory shocks to rainfall as a way of identifying shocks to income of farmers. It's been used many times since, for good and for ill. So Chris Paxson deserves the credit or blame. I've used it. Okay. There were related ideas in the literature. I won't tell you about that right now. Okay. So what Paxson wants to estimate is something like this. She wants to see if savings by farmer I in region R at time t depends upon the farmer's permanent income, that farmer's transitory income, maybe that farmer's income that she can't classify as either permanent or transitory, maybe on the variance of that farmer's income. That's to take care of the precautionary motive for savings, and maybe on household demographics to pick up life cycle motives. But this is what she's really interested in. She wants to see that alpha 2 is equal to 1. That is, that when the transitory income is high, people save a lot. When transitory income is low, people dissave. Okay. That's what she'd like to do. And the way she's going to do that is she's going to decompose income into these 3 components. Permanent income, which is going to depend upon maybe a time shock, because there might be permanent shocks to income in the entire economy. A regional effect on permanent income, because maybe certain regions are poorer than other regions. Maybe some household characteristics that affect your permanent income, like your education, and an error. And then she's going to have transitory income, depending upon maybe time effects. There could be transitory macroeconomic shocks, maybe transitory regional effects, and then this XIRT. And this XIRT is going to be rainfall measures. It's going to be measures of the deviation of rain in region R at time t. Okay. So that's going to be her key innovation, those rainfall measures. So that's the equation she wants to estimate. She doesn't actually see these YTs and YPs. So she's going to substitute them. She's just going to know that she's going to look at income, and she's going to see how measured income depends upon the determinants of transitory and permanent income. So she's going to look at how rainfall shocks affect income. That's going to be beta 2. And then she's going to look at and see how those same rainfall shocks affect savings. That's going to be gamma 2. And her key implication of the permanent income hypothesis is that alpha 2 is equal to 1. So what that means is that gamma 2 it's got to be equal to beta 2. So if a rainfall shock, so the intuition of this is, suppose you have a drought that affects farmer I at time t, and that drought causes the farmer to lose $100. That means beta 2 here is going to be 100. So one drought, $100 less income, so beta is negative 100. The same drought should cause savings to go down by 100 as well. So gamma 2 should be equal to negative 100 as well. So gamma 2 is equal to beta 2 is the key implication, that any transitory shock like rainfall that changes your income should change your savings by the same amount. Okay. Let me raise one issue that's concerning about how difficult it is to do this econometrically, and then I'll tell you about some results that use these methods. Rosenzweig and Wolpin noticed that in the data that Paxson uses, and the data that almost all of us use, for farmers, it's very difficult to measure their income. The problem is that what farmers care about is the profits on their farm. But we almost never observe farmer profits because of non-purchased inputs. So for example, family labor on the family farm is almost never measured in large-scale surveys. Or if it is measured, it's measured really poorly. Similarly, managerial inputs on farms or in businesses really can't be measured. But they're real inputs. It's a general problem. So what? Well, here's the so what. Let me simplify and suppose that farmers have access to a labor market, but that labor market expenditure is not recorded in the data. This isn't the real problem, but this gives you an idea of what the real problem is. Okay, so if that's true, the farmer's real income, the thing that the farmer cares about, given a rainfall realization R, is going to be equal to the optimal profit conditional on the rainfall that the farmer receives. let's suppose that the farmer's production function is just a function of rainfall and labor inputs. Let's leave out all the other inputs. And let's assume that we don't observe labor inputs, but of course the farmer does. So the farmer chooses labor on her farm, given the rainfall realization that year, to maximize this, the value of output minus the cost of labor. Okay, so that's the farmer's problem. That's what the farmer's going to do, obviously. And so obviously the farmer's going to use labor up to the point at which the marginal product of labor equals the wage rate. Okay. That's her optimal choice of labor input. So the effect of rainfall on the farmer's profit, well, that's going to be pretty easy. It's going to, let's see what happens. If we differentiate this with respect to R, we're left with the direct effect of rainfall on output. So the rainfall is going to affect output given an amount of labor. And then the rainfall is going to change the amount of labor that the farmer is going to use. And that's going to increase output by the marginal product of labor. And, well, if we increase labor because of the rainfall, we're going to have to pay it. So we lose wage times the amount of labor we've changed. So, of course, by a standard envelope argument, these last two terms disappear, right? Because this equals that. And if we factor this out, we're left with marginal product of labor minus the wage rate, which is 0. So this term is 0. So the effect of rainfall on profits is just the direct effect of rainfall on output. Okay. So that's what farmers really care about. If there's a shock to your rainfall, it's going to have a direct effect on your output. You're going to adjust inputs, labor, management, capital, seeds, whatever else. But by the envelope theorem, those adjustments in inputs are going to net out and have no effect on your overall profits. And what you're left with when you look at the effect of rainfall on profits is just the direct effect of rainfall on output. But if we don't observe these inputs, labor or management or other unobserved inputs that farmers use, if we don't observe those, we only observe gross output. We only observe how much they're producing. Or, in reality, we observe gross output minus some inputs, but not all inputs. We're always missing some inputs. Okay, so we're always missing some, and that's going to make this lesson very general. And so, since we don't observe all inputs, and here I'm making the extreme assumption that we don't observe any inputs, what we can estimate is just this, how output changes with rainfall. And that's going to be equal to the total derivative of F, that's the production function with respect to R, which is going to be equal to the direct effect plus the indirect effect, the marginal product of labor times the change in labor that happens when rainfall occurs. We're not observing this. We don't observe this, but that's inside this. This is what we can observe. So that's a problem, because we want to test the permanent income hypothesis by showing that the effect of rainfall on savings is the same as the effect of rainfall on the farmer's profit, which is equal to this, the effect of rainfall on savings divided by the effect of rainfall, the direct effect of rainfall on output. This is what we'd like to estimate. That's what we'd like to estimate. But we don't observe this. Instead, what we observe is the derivative of output with respect to R, which is equal to the direct effect plus the indirect effect. And we don't even know the sign of this last term. It depends upon how the marginal product of labor changes with rainfall. And that is a feature of the local agricultural technology. It might depend positively. If you have good rain, you might want to use more labor. because you're going to harvest more and you want to plant more and plant more intensively. Or if you've got good rain, maybe you use less labor because you don't have to irrigate, you don't have to replant. It may be that this could be the positive or negative. And so our estimate of the effect of rainfall on income could be an underestimate or an overestimate, which means that when we test to see if the effect of rainfall on savings, gamma 2, is the same as the effect of rainfall on income, we're estimating beta 2 incorrectly because we're not observing all the costs of the farmers. Okay, so that's something just to be aware of, that using rainfall or anything else as an instrument on data that doesn't fully correspond to what you think the farmer or the agent really cares about doesn't estimate what you think it's going to estimate. And so this is a call for just being aware of what your data measures. Are you really measuring the income of the farmer, or are you just measuring something that is related to the income of the farmer? Okay, so I'm now going to. So enough with the models. Let's talk about what's happening in reality. Paxson estimated her pioneering work using data from Thailand and farmers in Thailand, and she wasn't able to strongly reject the notion that farmers save their transitory income. In fact, it looked like farmers did a pretty good job of smoothing income shocks and protecting their consumption from income shocks in Thailand. Harunan Kazianga and I looked at the same problem in Burkina Faso, using data from the International Crop Research Institute for the Semi-Arid Tropics over a 5-year period in Burkina Faso. Now, this was in the midst of the worst drought in Burkina Faso's recorded history. Here's the long run path of rainfall in Burkina Faso. This red line segment describes the period of the data that we're using. And it's right in the depths of a really miserable, terrible drought from 1981 to 1985 in Burkina Faso. And so we're examining saving during a real crisis. Mean food consumption during that period was less than 50 cents per adult equivalent per day. The median consumption of energy was less than 2,000 kilocalories per adult equivalent per day. That's about 70% of the recommended level for a moderately active adult. Okay, so these are farmers who are poor and in a very bad crisis. The major source of wealth, the major asset that these farmers have is livestock. And so here's their livestock holdings in three regions of Burkina Faso, going from dry to relatively wet. In the Sahel, farmers held cattle and goats and sheep. In the Sudanian agroclimatic zone of Burkina Faso, there was no cattle, but farmers held many goats and sheep. In the Northern Guinean zone, there's some cattle and a moderate amount of goats and sheep. What's important to notice is that even at the end of this drought period during our data, most farmers, the median farmer, still had a good deal of livestock. All right, so we're going to just estimate a model like Paxson did, just the same thing. We've got better measures of inputs and outputs. And so we deal with the Rosenzweig-Wolpen critique of Paxton's work. We're going to look at farmer profits, farmer I in village V at time T. And we're going to see how these profits respond to village level rainfall shocks. FVT is going to be a village level rainfall shock, like total rainfall, deviated from its average in that village. And we're going to interact that village level shock with farmer characteristics XIVT. So this is going to be a village year specific shock. And this is going to be that village shock interacted with household specific variables, like how much lowland land do you have? How much upland land do you have? The reasoning being that two farmers in the same village, subject to the same rainfall shock, but one farmer farming upland land, the other farmer farming lowland land, will experience different effects of that rainfall shock on their profits. Right? The farmer with a lowland land in a drought is going to be less affected by the drought than the farmer with mostly upland land. And so this term is going to give us idiosyncratic variation in the effects of rainfall shocks within a village. And this term is giving us the aggregate effects of rainfall on everybody in the village. So that's what our transitory income is going to be comprised of, as these rainfall shocks and the rainfall shocks interacted. So we're going to do the same thing that Paxton did. We're going to estimate this equation, which is going to look at profits for farmer I in village V at time T as a function of various characteristics of that farmer that might affect the farmer's permanent income, like their education, the demographic structure of the household. This village shock, which is going to affect their transitory income. And this village shock interacted with characteristics, which is going to affect their transitory income, plus a farmer fixed effect on an error. And so our transitory income is going to be defined as these two terms. And our permanent income is going to be defined as this term. And then we're going to estimate how consumption responds to changes in permanent income and transitory income. And what we find is stunningly depressing. What we find is that shocks, transitory income, goes about 50-50 directly into consumption. That is, if you lose $100 as a consequence of a transitory rainfall shock, your consumption goes down by $50. Okay. If the permanent income hypothesis was correct, this coefficient would be 0. It's far from 0. And in fact, if we divide up between relatively rich and relatively poor within these villages, what we find is that it's 60% for the transmission of these transitory income shocks into consumption for the poor, and 50% for the rich, the relatively rich. And so we're seeing very poor farmers who are not eating enough, reducing their consumption when they get transitory income shocks. What savings there is, now we're turning from looking at consumption to looking at savings. What we find is that what savings takes place is taking place through grain storage, through accumulating and decumulating grain stocks over time. What we find is that about 20, if the permanent income hypothesis were right and all the savings were going through grain storage, this coefficient would be 1. So they would be increasing or decreasing their grain stocks to smooth their consumption from transitory income. And it's not 1, but it's not 0 either. So they are doing some smoothing with grain storage. What's interesting is that livestock is not being used to smooth at all. Rajat has a question on how village level rainfall data were captured and how many villages are in this study. There are only 6 villages in this study, so it's small, and rainfall level village level rainfall data were collected by ICRISAT by their resident enumerators who were living in those villages at the time. And so we've got good measures of the village rainfall during this time period. Then the historical data that we use to measure shocks with is not as good. It's got rainfall stations located in each agroclimatic zone that we use to benchmark the distribution of rainfall. Okay, so we're going to come back and try and talk a little bit more about why this might be the case, why it might be the case that farmers in Burkina Faso were so far from the permanent income hypothesis. Why is it that these poor farmers were unable to use borrowing and saving to smooth their consumption and protect it from these terrible shocks? Okay, we're gonna come back to that in a minute. What are the things that might limit self-insurance through savings? We've assumed frictionless borrowing and saving, right? That's what this equation was. We've assumed that you can just take some savings, and savings could be positive or negative. We could borrow and then pay back, or we could, and so asset T+1 might be negative, or we can save. And in any case, we can transfer resources between T and T+1 at this interest rate. But of course, credit might not be available, right? Abhijit talked about that. There's limited liability, there's incomplete information, there's transactions costs, and so on. And so it might be that there's constraints to making a T+1 negative. Okay, that would be borrowing. But usually you'd think we'd be able to save, right? Usually we'd be able to put money in a bank maybe, or buy a goat. Okay. So what will a household do if it can save but not borrow? Okay. This Angus Deaton has a nice paper that really clarifies this problem for how somebody should respond with this possibility that they can't borrow, that we're going to restrict asset holdings to being positive, or at least non-negative. Okay. What's interesting is that, and this is why I talked about prudence to begin with, is that borrowing constraints make a farmer look prudent, or a person look prudent, even if they don't have prudence. Okay. And they make prudence stronger if they strengthen the precautionary motive to save if utility does exhibit prudence. So it's a way of, so borrowing constraints make people behave prudently. Let's see how that works. So start with the assumptions that we used to get to the permanent income hypothesis, that is quadratic utility and the discount rate equal to the interest rate. Remember, this utility function does not have the precautionary motive, doesn't have prudence. The third derivative of this is equal to 0. Okay, so there's these quadratic preferences are risk averse, but don't exhibit prudence. But if we add a borrowing constraint that at every period asset holdings have to be positive, then the farmer is going to, then the person is going to behave as though they were prudent. Let me show you that. Okay, it's really easy to show in a 3-period model. Okay, suppose this, we're just going to have 3 periods. The Euler equation that we derived earlier in period 1 is going to be a little bit different. Remember, the Euler equation with these assumptions were that consumption in period 1 is equal to the expectation, that should be expectation in period 1, sorry. Expectation in period 1 of consumption in period 2. Okay, so that's what we had before, was this top line. But now with the restriction that assets can't be negative, you might be forced to just consume your cash on hand. Remember, in period 1, your cash on hand is the assets that you bring into period 1, plus the income that you realize in period 1. If you want to consume more, that is, you want to borrow, and you're not allowed to by this constraint, then you'll just consume everything you have. So the Euler equation becomes a little more complicated. Your consumption is equal to the expected value of consumption next period if you have positive savings. And your consumption is equal to your cash on hand if you're constrained. Okay. So let's now solve this model backwards. Let's solve from period 3. So in period 3, because it's the end of your life, you're just going to eat everything, right? So that's just because we made it a 3-period model. So in period 3, you eat everything. So in period 2, you've got the regular Euler equation with liquidity constraints. That is, your consumption in period 2 is going to be equal to the expected value of your consumption in period 3 if you're going to save, and it's going to be equal to your cash on hand if you want to eat more now. Okay, that is, if you want to borrow but you can't. So this is what your consumption in period 2 is. Now let's go back to period 1. Oh, sorry. So we can write period 2 as this. So consumption in period 2 is equal to the minimum of this or this. Expectation in period 2 of consumption in period 3. And expectation in period 2 of consumption in period 3 is, of course, just this. Okay. So all I've done is substituted this into here. And notice that C2 is going to be the minimum of this or this. Okay. And in period 1, we can do the same thing. Period 1 is going to be the minimum of consuming their cash on hand or the expected value in period 1 of C2. So if we just take this and plug it in here, we get the sort of ugly looking equation, this. But really it's nothing complicated. All I've done is taken the definition of C2, which we got here, and plugged it into this. Okay. So this is a funny looking equation. It's got a min of an expectation of a min. What's going on here? Suppose the variance of Y3 increases while we keep the expectation of Y3 fixed. If there were no credit constraints, as we saw half an hour ago, your consumption and the permanent income hypothesis just depends upon your expected income. So keeping the expected income fixed, but increasing the variance would have no effect on consumptions and savings in period 1 if there were no credit constraints. But with credit constraints, the increased variance of this thing makes it more likely that this term is binding. Because this variance goes up, that means this minimum gets smaller because a very bad shock in period 3 makes this get smaller. And as this gets smaller, that means it's more likely to be less than this. So this underlying term becomes more likely to be binding, which means that C1 has to fall. So even if the preferences are not prudent, that is, if they don't have that third derivative, precautionary motives generate additional savings when there's credit constraints. And the intuition is really logical. If you know you can't borrow and the variance of your income increases, it's more likely that that borrowing constraint is going to bind. And so to prevent that borrowing constraint from binding, you save more now so that you can use those savings to fight that shock in the future. Okay. So Burkinabe households were experiencing extreme aggregate transitory income shocks during severe drought. There was lots of idiosyncratic income variation, and lots of transitory shocks, but there was a very small amount of consumption smoothing. And the consumption smoothing that did occur was largely due to accumulation and decumulation of grain stocks. So most households experiencing a consumption decline, they still held livestock at the end of the period. But they didn't want to dissave those livestock because they were worried that if they got rid of that livestock and another bad income shock came, they wouldn't be able to protect their consumption at all. And so that potentially binding liquidity constraint plus herd management concerns that I haven't talked about, but there's also bioeconomic reasons for keeping a minimal herd around as well. That also helped this occur. But those two things together led households to destabilize their consumption intentionally in order to conserve livestock through the drought, both to protect themselves from potentially binding liquidity constraints and for herd management. So in Burkina Faso, farmers save in livestock and grain stocks. Those are by far the two most important forms of savings. None of these farmers had bank accounts, so there's no financial savings. And they use these buffer stocks to partly address credit constraints. Okay, so they use those grain stocks to smooth their consumption a bit. But constraints on savings appear important for many. Okay, certainly constraints on borrowing. And so Burkina Faso is an extreme case of this. I mean, this is a terrible drought, and it's farmers trying to maintain a viable livestock herd and a buffer stock against potentially terrible future shocks. But we don't need to look at such extreme cases to find evidence of constraints on savings by owners of small-scale businesses or farms. Dupont and Robinson have a great 2013 paper in AEJ Applied, I think, I can't remember, on savings constraints and microenterprise development in a more normal situation. So the setting for their study is in a Western Kenya market town. They have a sample of market vendors, also bicycle taxi operators, but I'm not going to discuss that subsample. These market vendors are very small scale. Think of folks who are selling tomatoes or fish. So very small scale, selling one item. Their mean daily investment is $6. So they're buying $6 worth of stuff and maybe selling it for $7. Okay, so it's a very small scale business. There's no use of formal savings or credit by these traders. And Dupont and Robinson do an RCT with these traders. And the RCT is fairly straightforward. They just take a random subset of them and they open up a savings account for them. The accounts pay a zero nominal interest rate. And there's inflation going on at 10 to 15%. And the savings accounts charge a withdrawal fee of like 50 cents to $1.50, so it's a lot. The bank is open for limited hours, like banks in so many parts of the world. There's no ATMs, so it's really inconvenient. So these are frankly terrible savings accounts. And Dupont and Robinson use data from the banks and from log books that they had the traders keep for 3 months, gathering data on their income, their expenditure, their health, their business activities, their labor supply, and importantly, transfers, both within the household and across households. So what do they find? The most stunning find is that these negative nominal return accounts were heavily used. That's sort of shocking. These are terrible savings accounts. Why are these people using them? And when they used them, the treatment group, the group that got savings, they were able to increase daily investment by 40 to 50%. So there's a big effect of these savings accounts on the business activities of these traders. And even sort of more stunningly, these traders not only increased their business activities, they were able to increase their private consumption expenditures. So by about 40%. So this is remarkable that these big impacts come from this terrible savings account. So first, why would you bother saving when the returns are negative? Why not just put the earnings that you get into the business? Well, one possibility is that there's lumpiness in business expenses. Expanding your business might require a lumpy expenditure. And so you might need to save in order to get that lumpy investment made. And then, of course, there might be variations over time in the returns to business investment. It might be like stupid to add money to your business during a time when demand is low. And business investment is irreversible, or at least, or reversible only at a cost. You buy more inventory, you got to sell it to get that money back. It might be better for you to have that money in a savings account where you can get it out again at a cost, but maybe the cost is lower than the cost of getting it out of your business. But why can't they find a better way of saving than using this formal bank account that has negative returns? So one plausible set of stories has to do with behavioral biases. Maybe this model, this benchmark model that I gave you is just nuts. Maybe people face all sorts of behavioral issues that prevent them from making an optimal savings plan and doing it like our model says. Or maybe it has to do with safety, family, or peer demands. So safety is obvious. You can get robbed. But there's some evidence that this may be part of what's going on in these Kenyan traders. Their deposits were relatively infrequent and larger than one day's expenditure. So it's not like they're going every day to deposit their money at the end of the day, which is what many behavioral models would lead you to do. A sophisticated time beta delta discounter might force themselves to make daily deposits just so they didn't have the cash to fritter away. But here, it looks like the deposits are relatively infrequent. They're larger than one day's expenditure, and they're planning to make these deposits, and they do. The pattern suggests that what they're doing is guarding against relatively infrequent but difficult to defend attacks on that money from friends and family. So it might be that every couple of weeks, your husband comes to you and says, I need money. And you can't say no to him if you have money, if you have cash. And so by depositing that money every week or so, you reduce your holdings of liquid cash against his or her demands. The use of the accounts was strongly correlated with ROSCA use and wealth. And so those are making it look like it's not so much people who are unable to accumulate wealth or unable to commit themselves to savings that use these savings accounts. It looks like it's people who are savings in other ways too. And so we'll see a few studies in a minute that show similar correlations between formal financial savings and other savings. So it looks to me like much of the patterns that DuPont and Robinson are uncovering could be attributed to the need for safety and protection against peer or family demands for your cash. And there's a question from Ajit about borrowing from these small-scale entrepreneurs before and after. I think that there is no formal sector borrowing at all. And I think informal borrowing only occurs in the context of ROSCAs, I believe, in this setting. And that would then, in the context of ROSCAs, you're borrowing when you're an early taker of the rotating savings and credit association. I'll talk in a minute about how ROSCAs work. Actually, I'll do that now, just in case people don't know. So a ROSCA, rotating savings and credit association, is a very common mode of savings throughout the world. It's a system, loosely put, where a group of individuals gets together and make a deal that says every week or every day, we're going to get together and we're going to put into a pile a certain amount of money each. And so every day we'll get together after work, we'll put $1 into the pot, and there's 10 of us. And in turn, each of the 10 of us will get that pot. And so the first day we'll all put $1 in, there's $10, person one gets the $10. And then we continue that for 10 days until everyone's had a chance to get the pot. So the first few people who get the returns from Araska are borrowing. They're borrowing on average from the others. And the last few people who get the pot have been saving. They've been lending to the others in the group. So there may be, there's borrowing through those Raskas, but I don't see in their paper any evidence that they've got data on other kinds of borrowing. Okay. So mobile money was used to similar effect in Uganda in Emma Riley's 2020 paper on resisting social pressure in the household using mobile money. She did an RCT among female microfinance borrowers. So now we've got a group of people who have been borrowing through microfinance organizations. And she randomized whether the loan was dispersed in cash or via mobile money. Okay. And what's fascinating is that she finds that business capital ends up being 11% higher and business income 15% higher for the mobile disbursement group after 8 months. So just changing, these are women who borrowed on average the same amount of money at about the same time. And all that differed was that half of them were randomized into getting the money in cash, and half of them got the money through mobile disbursements. And interestingly enough, the ones who had money in cash all had mobile accounts as well. So they could have just taken their cash and put it into mobile accounts. Okay, but they had this intermediary step of cash. And so this fact that the mobile disbursement, the disbursement through mobile money rather than through cash, leading to higher business outcomes, means that there's some friction between the cash and the business. And that friction appears to be concentrated amongst women who experience the greatest pressure to share their money with family at baseline. Another hint that one of the barriers to saving individually might be pressure from family members. More data on showing the potential for similar evidence that there's pressure from family that might inhibit savings comes from this great paper by Bernhardt, Field, Pandey, and Rigol on household matters from the AER Insights a couple of years ago. Capital shocks, randomized grants to female entrepreneurs, this paper argues, are often invested in her husband's enterprise. They use data from other RCTs, capital grants that were given to entrepreneurs in India, Sri Lanka, and Ghana. The enterprise level data in these RCTs show essentially no impact of the grants on women's enterprise profits. That's disturbing, right? At household level data in India and Sri Lanka, so now looking at the household as a whole, do show an increase in household income for women receiving grants. So the women who receive grants, nothing happens in their enterprise, but household income goes up. And in India, grants to female entrepreneurs have a large impact on other enterprise profits within the household. In Sri Lanka and Ghana, grants to women have higher enterprise returns when there are no other enterprises in the household. So if she's the owner of the only business in the household, there's more of an effect of the grant than if she doesn't. So to me, it looks like there's strong evidence in a variety of circumstances of women especially having demands on her finances that may interfere or shape the way she does savings. Okay, there's an interesting question. On the level of agricultural technology, do flows show behavioral biases? Absolutely. So that's a great paper in which we find that people put off buying fertilizer until it's too late, until they don't have enough money for it. I am not aware of any studies that examine the impact of savings on adoption directly, perhaps by providing savings accounts. So the idea would be that one way of dealing with a behavioral bias that is preventing you from accumulating enough capital to use, say, fertilizer at enough scale to make a difference, or to adopt a new technology like using insecticide or new seeds, perhaps. You might need to save up a critical amount of money in order to make that investment. And so I'm aware of studies that look at the dynamics of saving up to make these kind of investments. The one that first comes to mind is Townsend and I'll look it up at the very end. I'll give you that reference. I can't remember right now, but it's a Townsend paper that looks at precisely this issue of saving up enough in order to invest in a new technology, but it's not going to have a behavioral element to it. So I'll keep thinking about it. There are undoubtedly papers that do that I'm not thinking of right now. Anybody who knows of one could add it in the chat or the question and answer. Okay. I suspect I'm just not thinking of it at the moment. Okay, so DuPont Robinson and others have shown that increasing access to formal savings increases formal savings. That's not too surprising. So what? Well, what's exciting is that profits of businesses and expenditure on consumer goods also increase. So people look like they're getting better off. And so a natural question is, where does this money come from? If they're increasing their formal savings, what are they giving up? And that's the question that Collin, Demel, McIntosh, and Woodruff address in Restud a couple of years ago. Were savings constrained by commitment and self-control problems, like Pasqualina is going to talk about tomorrow? If that was true, we should observe a decline in consumption, right? If it's self-control and you're frittering away your money rather than saving it, if you provide a formal institution for savings and people increase their savings, they should be financing that savings out of a decline in the consumption of those items that you were previously frittering away the money on. Maybe they're avoiding intra-household barriers to savings. Maybe it's the thing we were just talking about. Maybe it's women being able to save now because they're protecting themselves from the demands of other members of their household for money at unanticipated times. If that's the case, we should observe a decline in intra-household transfers. That's why it's so important to collect data on those transfers. And they might perhaps reduce the use of alternative ways that they might have been hiding savings. They might buy fewer goats and instead put the money in a formal bank account. Or maybe the intervention just redirects formal savings. Maybe money that they would have put in a ROSCA, they're now putting it in the bank. Okay, we should see declines in ROSCA participation or contributions if that's the case. Maybe there's production function non-convexities. Maybe what's going on is that consumption declines, transfers out decline, other investments decline. You put that money into savings, it grows and grows, and eventually you take it out in a big lump and you make the lumpy investment that you've been saving up for. Or maybe the money comes from increases in labor supply. Maybe you've now got a new way of saving that increases the return to you of working now because you can save it at a better interest rate or a less negative interest rate than you could before. And so you've got a positive substitution effect. You are better off working now than later, relative to later, because you've got a new option for what to do with the money you earn. And now there might be a negative income effect from that because you've expanded the budget possibility of the household by giving them access to savings. But all our evidence so far is that those income effects are at most very tiny negatives and most likely positive, in fact. And so we would expect to see an increase in labor supply as the possibilities of savings improve. So Colin et al. Work with a bank that in Sri Lanka that started a program of deposit collectors. So deposit collectors are a common institution in many countries. They're related to Raskas, in fact. In fact, both are called by the same name in southern Ghana, Susus. They visit savers at home or at a business place to collect deposits every day or every week. And then at a given time, they give the money back. Okay, it could be done informally or it could be done formally. Sri Lanka's National Savings Bank in 2008 began a program with agents. They gave them wireless terminals to record deposits and withdrawals. And the bank agreed to expand the program to remote areas to reach lower income underbanked households. So treated households, so there's going to be another RCT. And the treatment is going to be giving a household assistance to open the account, including the payment of the minimum required balance, which is relatively small. And then after opening the account, the mobile operators would show up to collect deposits from treatment families. And so there's effectively what this does is increases the real interest rate that these families faced by about 5%. The sample was mostly daily wage workers and self-employed. These are people who are generating income on a day-to-day basis. So they're good targets for a weekly deposit collection. And so they're getting money every day. And so there might be a reason for them to participate in a program that collected savings every week. And the sample was organized around Raskas because they wanted to make sure, they wanted to see if the source of the formal funds that were deposited in these savings accounts was the informal savings that they were doing through Raskas. Okay. So this is randomized. I'm not going to give you these details. I'll skip those details. What do we find? What we find is that the treated households saved, they transacted, they deposited and withdrew. They saved a lot more in the banks. And in fact, their total savings, including informal and cash savings, which weren't affected at all, their total savings went up. So this is fascinating. Treated households have an immediate increase in total income. So savings went up immediately and total income went up immediately as well. So there was no support for what we were just talking about saving up to invest in a new technology and then getting the returns from that new technology. We don't have the savings invest earning pattern that would be generated by non-convexities, where you save up, then you invest, then you earn more money, and then you save again. Instead, what we see is an immediate increase in income and an immediate increase in savings. There's no change in transfers they observed to other household members. There's no decrease in consumption. Again, this is making it look like it's not intra-household barriers to savings. This is making it look like it's not behavioral barriers to savings. What instead we see is labor hours increasing at market wages. So people are shifting into doing more work at the market wage. They're shifting out of self-employment into wage labor. So they're shifting from their businesses actually into wage labor, which is not what these guys expected. And within self-employment, whatever increases there were focused on manufacturing, which is exportable. Okay, and so it looks like what they're doing is increasing their labor supply either to the wage labor market or in producing stuff that can be exported at a fixed price. Okay. So there's some minor evidence in the paper of self-control problems. There's no larger effects for those initially lacking control over savings. So no support for that, for the possibility that people were not saving because they were worried that people would take it from them. There's no evidence of crowd out of the rotating savings and credit associations. The main barrier to savings in this context was the low return to saving. So the reason people weren't saving was because they were getting a low interest rate. And when we have this effective 5% increase in the real interest rate, people saved more. And so the barrier to savings was that savings just had a low return. And so when we increased the return to savings, people saved more. And so the barriers, the external barriers to saving that we have seen are demands from others within your household and your peers, the transactions costs and low interest rates that savings earn, and the constraints to reaching savings, that is just the transactions costs of engaging in savings. The barriers, the external barriers to smoothing consumption via saving and borrowing, as in the permanent income hypothesis, appears to be largely the liquidity constraints that prevent borrowing, which forces people to rely on buffer stock savings to protect themselves against multiple repeated shocks that could wipe out their precautionary savings and subject them to direct exposure to transitory income shocks. So that's where I'm going to stop. And I'm going to, I see one live question. This is correct. Suzanne, thank you. There is a paper from Esther Duflo and Jonathan Robinson, actually, and Kramer, I think, nudging farmers to use fertilizer, right? That's not directly on savings, but it fits perfectly into what Pascaline Dupas is going to talk about tomorrow. And yes. Okay. And Pascaline is going to talk about precisely this problem of not being able to discipline yourself enough to save in order to buy fertilizer when you need it, and by allowing fertilizer, by forcing farmers to buy fertilizer with a voucher immediately after harvest when they have money, you're able to overcome that behavioral constraint. So that's a very important paper. And there will be other papers that have looked at the use of formal savings in order to encourage people to adopt technology. And Pascaline's going to talk about that tomorrow. Okay. Well, thank you, everybody. If there's no further questions, I will stop in a moment. Great. Well, thank you guys very much. Do come back tomorrow, again at the unusual time, because of the crazy daylight savings mismatch between the US and the rest of the world. And I hope you enjoy the rest of the course. So long, everybody. Bye.